For those who don't know me, I am teaching at Friedensauer Adventist University in Germany. I'm responsible there for the program in counseling, an MA in counseling. And just to share the joyful news, when the topic is rather more gloomy, we just got re-accredited for another 8 years by the government accreditation services. You know, we never are so sure about the AAA, but we are very sure that we have done good work when the government gives us 8 years of accreditation for our programs. Now, I would like to start off with a little disclaimer before even we go into the topic. The disclaimer being, I am a pastoral counselor. I'm a pastoral counselor. That means I do hold an MDiv from Andreas University. I'm an ordained Seventh-day Adventist pastor. And I got my MA in counseling in addition to the MDiv and a PhD in pastoral counseling. So I always like to integrate my social science approach with theology as well. I'm mentioning this because I'm not a psychotherapist. I'm not a psychotherapist and I'm not a psychiatrist. Sometimes it is needed to explain the difference. A psychotherapist comes from psychology. A psychiatrist always comes from medicine. So I'm not a medical doctor. I do not I'm not limited, let me put it this way, to a medical model when it comes to suicide. We'll talk about that a little later. So I come particularly from the pastoral counseling perspective, which, as I said, is an integration of counseling, social sciences, and including perhaps psychotherapy. The term varies in use, and theology. Further on, as a disclaimer, I would like to be very open, very upfront, that I've been in treatment myself for dysthymia, which is a kind of mild but continuous form of depression, which I've been treated for as well. Some people would say Germans always suffer from dysthymia because they always are so serious and always see problems everywhere. No, it's a bit of a personality trait, I would suggest. And my depression first showed up when I was 18 while I was studying at Newbold College and included suicidal ideation. So if you want, I know from personal experience what I'm talking about. Long before I dealt with the topic of suicide in a professional capacity. And I would like to reveal that I had one case of successful suicide in my professional career. I've seen all the hands raised already. Many of you have had similar experiences somewhere along the line, but I can assure you the one case of successful suicide it has been extremely traumatic for me and at the same time relieving. And that may give away a little bit about where I stand on the topic. In a way, and that can be misunderstood, I know, in a way I was glad this person was finally able to make a decision that brought her to final peace and rest. May sound weird, but it's a long story behind it. Why this disclaimer? Very simple. I already guessed when preparing that I'm not alone with this experience. And statistically, I am quite sure, and you've raised your hand, so I know by now, that there are people among us who have lost someone to suicide. Okay, and I'm quite sure that we also have a number of people in this group this afternoon or evening who have had suicidal ideation themselves, or some suicide attempts even. And I am very sure that we have people among us who currently are struggling with depression. So let me say in advance, and this is part of the disclaimer, this is not a group counseling session. Okay, in the announcement for our session today, I gave a little warning to people who have recently lost somebody through suicide to consider whether they really would like to attend. If so, you should have somebody close by who can hold you, who can be there for you if ever something is getting triggered within you as you listen to the session today. So in other words, take responsibility to take good care of yourself, because especially with a topic like this, the medium internet has certain risks. If somebody is kind of getting into trouble, it is very difficult to intervene over the internet. And secondly, do not just be mindful of your own needs, be mindful of others in this group. I just invite you to remember and keep in mind that we have people in our group that are struggling, that bring along experiences that may be very painful. Now, I said this is not a group counseling session, and yet it doesn't hurt if our meeting is a healing one. And I certainly hope and pray that some of the points we are discussing today will be helpful, will be comforting, will be healing in one way or another. Now, Lauren, because I'm late today rather than early as planned, we haven't discussed this again, but I think I mentioned before that I would like to use a few breakout sessions. And in fact, I would like to start off with a little breakout session for you. Now, when you hear the term suicide, I want you to discuss who comes to your mind first. So who comes to your mind when you hear suicide? And number two,
See, I'm
what
already in it.
images
Right.
are in your
So I
head
really should.
when you hear suicide? What images are in your head? The next part will deal with what you need to know, and after that we'll have a part dealing with biblical perspectives, and then we go into our plenum discussion, which hopefully will be a discussion, i.e. more than just questions and answers, because I do not believe that I have all the answers when it comes to this particular topic. So what you need to know, as I mentioned before, this is a pastoral counseling perspective on suicide. I follow a certain model of conviction there. I'm not a medical person. I'm not a psychologist or psychotherapist, though I use a lot of knowledge from medicine and psychotherapy, but also from social sciences, and particularly when I talk pastoral counseling, theology. So that's always in the back of my head, and I think it's important for you to realize that. Now, first of all, let's talk a little bit about the prevalence of suicide, just to give us an idea, because I think that suicide is one of the last taboos we have in society. Globally, an estimated 700,000 people die by suicide each year. Now, just to give you an idea what that means, 700,000 people a year, just think of your local community, your village, your town where you live. think of how many people live in that place, and then you know roughly what 700,000 people means. If you break it down per 100,000 people, there's 1 0 missing, but you get the idea. Per 100,000 people, in the US, there are 11 suicides per 100,000. In Switzerland, despite the wonderful chocolate, there are 20 suicides per 100,000. And in Eastern European countries, you even have 30 per 100,000, which tells us something already. If I want to be nice to you who are watching in the US, it means you in the US obviously are more optimistic and more drawn to life than to death, while in Eastern Europe, where the number is almost 3 times as high, the issues and problems that people face, the communist past and so on, raises the number of suicides. Now, perhaps I should add that I myself grew up in the city that had the highest rate, as an urban area, the highest rate of suicide during the times of the Cold War and after. I come from Berlin, and Berlin has been surrounded by a wall, and some people suspect that in the 60s, 70s, 80s, until the wall came down in 89, many people felt very isolated in their situation. So it's why I'm mentioning this. It's not just a psychological thing. There is a sociological perspective, a political perspective. Eastern Europe versus USA may be an indicator of that as well. There are an estimated 10 to 20 million suicide attempts each year. And that gives you a broad idea of how serious the topic is, because in effect, more people die through suicide than through war and homicide combined. Now, I have to be careful. These are global statistics. If you go to downtown Chicago, probably homicide is higher than suicide, but on a global scale. On a global scale, more people die through suicide than through war and homicide combined. We hear a lot about war, we hear a lot about homicide, but we hear fairly little about the great number of losses through suicide. Furthermore, suicide is among the highest causes of death among youth. Now, places 1, 2, and 3, when it comes to deaths among young people, are usually shared, and there's a little bit of variance depending on the region, the country, but it varies between accident and suicide and homicide. So suicide usually is among the first 3 causes of death for people 18 years and younger. It definitely is the number 1 cause of death for young people from the LGBTQ community. As many of you are aware, the whole issue of LGBTQ is a very, very hot one in our church at the moment. Definitely in Germany, where a book came out that dealt with the topic, and a conference, a symposium was held, and so forth, and lots of trouble have resulted. But this is something that we need to realize, that the LGBTQ community has to suffer an awful lot from the phenomenon of suicide. What you also need to know, suicide rates are higher for men than for women. So more men than women commit suicide, that is, successfully. They complete the suicide. The rate of suicide attempts, however, is much higher for women than for men. This is easily explained and has primarily to do with the methods chosen. The methods chosen by females usually are less lethal, less brutal, I might say. Men usually shoot themselves, hang themselves, or throw themselves in front of the train or out of high places, down from high places, while females often use medications, overdose on something, or try to open their, what do you call it, their, what's the word for it, their pulse veins in the bathtub, things like this, or use gas, and more often have a chance of being recovered and saved.
Slit. It slit the wrists.
Slit. Thank you. Yeah, slit the wrist. Thank you. Now, when it comes to reasoning for suicide, I called it not reasons. It's more the reasoning for suicide, or the model that people try to explain this phenomenon by. First of all, there is a medical model which primarily suggests the reason behind it is mental illness, primarily, obviously, depression. Okay. There may be other mental illnesses as well. I count that generalizing here as a kind of medical model. A psychological model would be something like, this is anger that is turned inside rather than to the outside. And it's often anger that is really directed at some other person, at other people. I once had, and that was a psychiatrist teaching on suicide. He said whenever they were in the ER and made somebody survive suicide, the first time when they opened their eyes, he went to them and said, "Who are you so angry with that you committed suicide?" And people always, he reported at least, people always felt found out. They could name somebody they were angry at. So a lot of anger that is turned inside would be a psychological model. But there also could be a sociological model that would have to do with hopelessness. If you do not have any perspective in life, if you don't have a goal, an aim, something that is worth living for, and that can be something rather collective and influenced not so much by your personal psyche, by your personal life, but can be influenced by what is happening around you in this world. And of course, there is a theological model. There may be several, but theologically speaking, you might say the reasoning behind suicide is a separation from God. Now, what is behind it is the idea sin is not an act, the individual act that we do, but the fact that we are separated from God. So sin is not just doing something wrong, but sin is something, in theological terms, is something that has to do with being separated from God. And obviously the ultimate expression of being separated from God is death. However, we have to be careful. Separation from God does not cause suicide. That would be far too simple. If it did, the numbers of suicides would be much, much higher, obviously. But it can be an expression of the separation from God. That would be a theological explanation, if you want. There also is, I should mention that, a pseudo-religious model. Some people might say it's a religious model, and that is demon possession. I don't really want to get into that topic, but we might have people here from cultures and subcultures that strongly suggest that if somebody commits suicide, that person has been demon possessed in one way or another, because God meant us to live rather than to kill ourselves. And there's some logic to it, but I'm very careful with these kind of terminologies for various reasons, but hopefully we don't go into that too deeply. So if we look at causes of suicide, and that would be something slightly different than the rationale, so to speak. Number one is depression, definitely. Most people who commit suicide are, I believe, depressed, and I would like to find relief. And if we accept the anger model that I presented before, it may be a way of expressing revenge. Okay, that would be depression, anger turned inside, but basically depression is so painful that people don't see any hope, any perspective in life, and kill themselves. So it's a symptom, if you want, of depression. Cause number two that I would like to mention is pain. People commit suicide because of pain. And now I'm coming from the mental health field. However, I've worked as a hospital chaplain for quite a number of years. And I can tell you, people had physical pain from cancer or whatever. And when I did my rounds as a chaplain, I was more than once, I was asked by patients, you know, you're the chaplain, you probably have access to some medication that I can kill myself, because the pain is so unbearable. And, you know, you would put to sleep any dog or cat in my condition. But so please help me that I can put an end to all this. And to be very frank, obviously, I wasn't able to do that. I didn't want to do that. I chose not to do that. And if I wanted to, I wouldn't have had the means. But it was painful to hear people being so much in physical pain that they wanted to end their life. And it's easy to talk about hope and confidence and all that. If people are in pain, it just doesn't work. The very interesting thing, and this was an aha experience for me, the great thing was, if I visited the same people a couple of days later and they had proper pain medication and felt much better, they didn't even remember that they had asked for medication to kill themselves. You know, it was, the whole idea was gone, and that's why I'm very much for helping people in pain to get out of pain, and to have a good treatment. What do we call it? Can't think of the English word at the moment, but you know what I mean. Hospice treatment, this kind of thing, where people are getting good care for their physical pain. More importantly, and I pointed at that already, is the emotional pain that leads people to suicide. And I already mentioned, among the LGBTQ plus community, suicide is especially high due to the harassment that they experience, due to the constant mobbing, due to the emotional pressure that is put on them. And I got a little taste of it during the past half year, when just one little article about the topic, which was a fairly harmless article, brought me a shitstorm that I never had experienced before. And I'm still recovering from it. Okay. So the emotional pain can lead people into suicide. LGBTQ is one community, but those victims of sexual abuse are another big, large community that is very much at risk for suicide. The one case I mentioned, I had one case in my professional career, was a woman who had experienced severe sexual abuse within her family. And when she was in her mid-40s, she finally ended her life. Another reason which is quite different from the pain issue is fear. People commit suicide because they have fears. One big fear, and you find that even in biblical examples, we come to them later on, is the fear of enemies. If I fall into my enemies' hands, what will they do for me, with me? And how will they treat me? And they might torture me, and they might try to figure out some things I'm not able to tell them anyway. So the best way is to not allow them to get a hold of me. So in light of enemies, people sometimes kill themselves, or they fear illness. And one particular illness that leads some people to suicide is dementia. You know, if you lose it and eventually you do not have control, you do not have the option to choose to end your life because you are too forgetful. So some people start considering suicide at the onset of dementia or other illnesses like cancer, of course, being scared of the pain of the treatment and all the rest of it. There also is what we call a balance sheet suicide. You know, people taking stock of their lives and thinking, what was it all about? Was it worth it? Is it worth it? If I tabulate everything together, it really doesn't make sense. I better make an end to it. So that kind of suicide oftentimes happens, which may be the most rational, if you want, the most rational way. There's a lot of reflection beforehand to do this. And finally, you have suicide caused by a greater good, the self-sacrifice that some people commit suicide for. They give their lives for somebody else, for some greater good. And you may know stories that sometimes are told as children's story, which I find rather gruesome. But even the story of salvation, Christ giving himself for us, could be considered as something like a self-sacrifice for a greater good. Now, some people might argue that, and I'm not keen on defending that position, but I just want to explain that suicide can happen as a sacrifice for a greater good. And there are many wartime stories, for instance, where people sacrificed, risked their lives and for a greater good. Okay, let's share some myths that are around about suicide, which I think are very important to know, and especially to know they are myths. They're not truth. Number one, those who speak about it don't do it. You know, dogs that bark don't bite, they say. So if people talk about suicide, they're not going to do it. Wrong. In fact, most people who commit suicide talk about it before they do, in one way or another. Sometimes we recognize only after, unfortunately. A suicidal gesture is not serious. You know, there are these stories of women who turn on the gas oven. You still know in America, I don't know, or what a gas oven is, the stove. They turn on the gas on their stove just when they hear their husband coming up the stairs. Okay, so they know they will be found in time. It's just a gesture, and therefore it's not to be taken serious. Wrong. That's a myth. Because what happens if the gesture is not taken serious, you have to make this gesture a little bit stronger, so to be more convincing. And the next time round, the gesture may be lethal for the person who is doing it. So a suicidal gesture is very, very serious business. Another myth, children don't do it. Wrong. Think again. Children do commit suicide, though it is comparatively rare. Once they are through puberty, the risk is increasing sharply. But children do commit suicide as well. There are cases of that. Oftentimes, we think that suicide is a spontaneous act. It's like a short circuit somewhere in the wires of the brain or somewhere that people suddenly decide, oh, I'll kill myself. No, that is wrong. Oftentimes, or usually, in fact, suicide is premeditated for a long time. Oftentimes, it is planned very carefully. And it's rarely a spontaneous thing, very rarely. And another myth, suicide is a free will decision. In fact, in German, we have a word for suicide, which is kind of a euphemism, which is called Freitod. Freitod means free death, a death that you choose, that you are free to choose. No, suicide is not really a free will decision. At least a free will decision would be a fairly rare exception. And some medical people would say it never is a free will decision. But of course, here I'm hinting already at some philosophical problems, as you will see in a moment. Now, the final one is very, very important in terms of how we deal with people who we think might be suicidal. Some people have the idea that if somebody might have some suicidal ideation in his or her head going around, we better not ask about it because we might plant an idea in their heads. And that is proven wrong again and again. We don't. If we ask someone about suicidal ideation, we do not give them the idea, oh, yeah, that's a good idea. I could kill myself. No, we don't. It's rather, if there is no suicidal ideation and we ask about it, they'll tell us, no. I have no thoughts of killing myself or harming myself. And if they do have suicidal ideation, they might say, yes, how do you know? Does it show or something like that? So we do not have to be afraid asking about suicidal ideations if we suspect something like this. Let me show you some warning signs of suicide. Depression would be number one, of course. Depression, the easiest way to detect depression in a person is a loss of energy and zest, and also a preoccupation with thoughts about death. A preoccupation with thoughts about death, that can be a clear indicator for depression, though if you are not a mental health professional, do not attempt to diagnose. That's a little disclaimer. Another warning sign of depression I already hinted on is direct announcement. Now, if people say, I am suicidal, I want to kill myself, you can measure the acuteness of such a statement by times and means. I'll come to that in a moment. But even if it's a game, if it's a gesture, a suicidal gesture, if they're just playing with you, it's still to be taken very, very seriously. I'm going to kill myself. I'm going to shoot myself. With what? You don't have a gun? Oh, well, I'm just saying this. We still should listen very carefully. There also are indirect announcements. They are more difficult to detect, and that's why I give them special mention here. Indirect announcements are like giving away prized belongings. I've been, let's say, a stamp collector all my life and have been very proud of my stamp collection, and I suddenly give it away to some pathfinder at church. Here you have my stamp collection. Something like this would be an indirect announcement. I'm preparing for death. I don't need my prized belonging anymore. Or also a sudden elation of people in the middle of depression. If people always seem gloomy to you, rather depressed, very low mood, and suddenly they seem cheerful and happy, they either took some medication that I would like to have as well, or they have come to a decision that is easing their pain and gives them a perspective. And this is exactly where we need to be very, very careful, and perhaps even ask, you are so happy, what's going on in your life that you are so happy? I have seen you very serious oftentimes before, and we have talked about serious issues in the past, something like that. Okay, these are some of the warning signs I think we can recognize. We do not always recognize, and we have to be very, very sure that as relatives, friends, those who stay behind, that we do not develop guilt feelings for what we experience or somebody else is deciding. But it can be helpful to be watchful when it comes to such signs. At this time, Lauren, we come to the second of 3 breakout sessions.
Okay.
And so let's get ready for it. I'll tell you what I would like you to discuss, and we'll take about 7 minutes for it. Imagine, just imagine, and this is not remembering, it's imagining, okay? Imagine someone confides in you that he or she has the intention to commit suicide. And what I want you to discuss, and this is a more theoretical discussion, that's why I say imagine, don't remember, what you have experienced in the past. Why do you assume the person does so? Why do they confide in you that they want to commit suicide? It may seem obvious to you, and that's why I want you to reflect and discuss a little bit. To be kept from suicide would be one option, and there may be more options. Maybe to say farewell would be another option. Maybe to get permission, absolution, or encouragement to do so.
Forgiveness.
Forgiveness, yeah, exactly. Or even to get assistance. Can you help me to do this properly, that I don't, that I don't end up a cripple or something like that? So this is the breakout session number 2, 7 minutes, discuss it. And it may seem easy at first, but you'll be surprised that people in your group may have very different ideas about this. So it's not as easy as you think. I'll get you to work here. I hope that the discussions dealt a little bit about the different reactions we think people, the reasons why people tell us about suicide, because I believe we need some pre-intervention before we intervene in terms of suicide. We need to reflect a little bit on it, and there is an ethical decision we have to make for ourselves, and I'm very global, very abstract here. There's an ethical decision we need to make, and that is, ethics is about right and wrong. Is it right to intervene in another person's decision? Is it right to intervene when somebody says, I really would like to end my life? Or do we believe in free choice in an adult decision that a person can make? Now, most of us probably would think it is a good idea to intervene in one way or another. Is it an option or is it an obligation? That would be an ethical question. And a question very closely related to it that we need to answer for ourselves beforehand even. Can I prevent suicide? And the answer to that question is very, very simple, 2-letter word, no. Ultimately, we cannot prevent suicide if somebody is bent on doing it. However, practically speaking, in many cases, the answer is yes. We can do something about it, and I believe we should. So let me offer some intervention strategies here. First of all, and I hinted on that already before, we need to assess the acuteness. The more acute the suicidal ideation is, the more quickly we need to intervene. The assessment is easily done. Is there a plan? Is there a set time for the suicide? Because oftentimes people who want to commit suicide very carefully think about timing. You know, on my 40th birthday or on Sabbath morning, something like this. So is there a time, a set time for the suicide? And are the means available that I've planned? You know, if somebody says I'm going to shoot myself and doesn't have a gun, it's different than if we know there is a Magnum or a Peacemaker in his cupboard drawer. So are the planned means available? If the answer to these three questions is yes, there is an immediate need to intervene directly. I once was on the phone with a suicidal person and was told that this person had medications that potentially were lethal. So I asked that person over the phone to flush it down the toilet as an immediate intervention to take away the means. So we need to assess the acuteness of the situation, and we need to create safety. That's a big one for many topics, not just for suicide, but we need to create safety. That is, we take away the means, we win time. You know, let's make a commitment. You don't kill yourself this night. Tomorrow is a new day, and we'll talk together in the morning and discuss how to go on. You win some hours, you win a little bit of time, and indeed next morning things may look very different. So you formulate clear agreement, you contract with a person. Do not contract in the sense of never again allow yourself to think about it. The contracts should be short-term and should be realistic. I want you to promise that you will not harm yourself until we have our next session. This is something that I sometimes do with clients, that I ask them to commit themselves not to harm themselves while they are in counseling. What they do after, it's up to them. I respect their free decision, their free will choice, but for the time being. So the agreement, the contract is very short, and it is the shorter, the more acute the situation is. You know, sometimes it may be, I'll call you in an hour, and until then, I want you to do nothing, to listen to some good music, and I'll call you and we'll see what happens next, you know, especially if people are long distance and I can't drive over to the place. But we have to be very, very careful about such arrangements. I remember my teacher in pastoral care at Newbold College, he told us about his trauma when he got a phone call, Pastor, I'm going to kill myself. And he said, you hold it, I'll jump into my car and drive over to you. Don't do it, let's talk first. So he hung up, jumped into the car and drove over to the person that had called him and got into a traffic jam. And by the time he arrived at the home of the person, it was too late. So we have to be very careful about such contracts, that they are doable, that they make sense, that they are short term, and that they do not, that they are not based on something we cannot fulfill. And a general goal to create safety, and this is where church comes in, I believe, we have to strengthen social networks. Oftentimes, suicidal people are very lonely, are isolated, and it is helpful to get them into larger networks, into touch with people who care about them, who are interested in doing something with them, things like that. So social networking is very, very important. The suicide becomes more unlikely the more people are in their social network. Now, obviously, if all fails, get help. I mean, that should be fairly obvious. Call a suicide hotline if there's one available in your area, or call emergency services. Do not leave the person alone if there is an acute situation. Now, in Adventist Today Sabbath seminars, we usually have a very global community listening in. So I just want to give this little hint. There are different legal requirements when it comes to suicide and attempting suicide and reporting attempted suicide, things like this, and how we need to act may be different from country to country. That is represented here tonight. But please get help. It's not really a legal issue, it's an ethical issue that we do get help. Post-intervention activities, that is after somebody has been taken out of the acute situation that he or she wants to kill themselves, follow up in short intervals, emphasis is on short intervals, refer to professional treatment, i.e. to professional counseling or therapy, or to some psychiatric consultation. Sometimes medication is very appropriate in such cases, but refer, don't do it for yourself. You don't have to. And that is very close to my heart and very important. Get some kind of debriefing, get some supervision, get something for yourself. Because if you deal with a suicidal person, it will do something to you. And I mentioned at the beginning that I had one professional case of suicide in my career, and I noticed that I needed help and supervision and debriefing during the funeral, where I cried more than the parents of the victim. And I was the person conducting the funeral. I mean, that was embarrassing, was unprofessional. But I noticed I was suffering so tremendously from that suicide that I needed help as well. Okay, let's come to the last part, and it will be shorter because we want to get into a little bit of discussion, and it's an hour earlier than usual on my watch, but it's the proper time. We need to wind up eventually, and that is biblical perspectives. And that's a quick one. Let's just do 3 minutes here for our breakout session. And the breakout session number 3, it's the last one, will be on biblical examples, the Bible and suicide. And I would like to invite you, what stories in the Bible do you remember? The off is at the wrong place, of people committing suicide. Okay, what stories do you remember of people committing suicide in the Bible? And number 2, what biblical characters come to mind that were suicidal, i.e. that wanted to die immediately? Okay. And perhaps if you have a couple of names, there are not all that many, but if you have a couple of names, please discuss among yourselves the implication of your findings. So we are turning very theologically here. Discuss what it means when you think of name A, name B, name C, that comes to your mind in terms of having committed suicide or having some suicidal ideation, as we would call it in the clinical language. Okay, I would like to give look at biblical examples. That would be the first part, if you want, of theology, of doing theology here, and provide you with two ideas, two theses that we can discuss, or you can build an antithesis to it, or a synthesis, or whatever you like to do. And the first thesis I would like to share with you is suicide in the Bible is preceded, often is preceded by a separation from God. We have, somebody found out quickly on the internet, which is cheating, but that's okay here anyway. Somebody looked up, there are 7 cases of suicide in the Bible, actually. You can look it up on the internet. But Abimelech was one of them. It was a kind of assisted suicide, if you want. You find it in Judges 9, verse 54. And Abimelech wasn't a particularly nice person. If you want to know more, read up on him. King Saul and his arm bearer was not a nice person. He had lost his connection to God. You remember he went to this witch of Endor and tried to get in touch with Samuel to communicate about some divine things, and eventually everything was lost, and he killed himself, and his armor bearer followed suit. So he was separated from God. And Zimri, a case that is less well known, he, if I remember rightly, burned himself after he saw everything was lost. So it's kind of this balance sheet suicide. I don't have a chance, so I kill myself. But he was also reported to be separated from God. Now the thing is, and Judas, my friend, why have you come? So until the very end, Jesus gave him an opportunity to return, but he opted to stay away and go away from Jesus. He was separated from God. And why I point this out is that not the suicide is the real problem in these cases. The suicide is just a consequence of it. Okay, the separation from God has taken place before, and that's part of my thesis here. Now, of course, there are some exceptions. Samson would be one, which would be a kind of example of self-sacrifice, and some people argue, no, Samson didn't commit suicide. Yes, I think he did, but there's a different flavor to it. And Ahithophel, another name that is not so well known, if you're curious enough, look him up and find out whether he would fit that description. I would have the hunch, no, he was not separated from God, yet he did commit suicide. So my first thesis, suicide in the Bible often is preceded by a separation from God. So the separation from God is the sin rather than the suicidal act. Suicidal ideation in the Bible happens quite often as well, and usually is linked to exhaustion, not sin. And I'm not saying depression here, I'm saying exhaustion, though usually it has a flavor of depression. You find Moses who doesn't want to go on living if God doesn't save his people. You might as well kill me. Or you can think of Elijah, who sat under the bush after Mount Carmel and said, it's enough, I had enough, take my life, it's over. And instead he got some bread and some water to drink and some sleep. And then he got some bread and some water to drink and some sleep. And then he got some water to drink and some bread to eat and some sleep. So that was God's treatment of his depression, his exhaustion, and then he gave him a new calling, a new task, a new challenge, and he started walking. And if you think of New Start or something like that, of course, that moving around, getting exercise is very important in suicide prevention. And then you find Jonah, who was so exhausted, actually, that he was sleeping in the belly of the ship as it describes in the Bible, that he didn't even wake up in the grave storm where all the seamen, who are experienced sailors, were crying aloud to their gods, and Jonah was still asleep. So he was exhausted, all right. And his suicidal ideation becomes very clear. In fact, I would consider him a suicide. He tells them, just throw me overboard and everything will be fine for you. I'll die, but you'll live. And of course, he didn't die, but that was not because of his choice. That was because of God's choice. Now, these are just characters of the Bible that I've looked at very quickly. And I would also like to add two theses in terms of biblical principles. And this is not an argument about suicide. It's a theological argument that I apply to suicide, to the topic of suicide. Number one, forgiveness hinges on Christ's last moment, not on ours. Let me explain what I'm saying here. Some 16 years ago, I had just been called to teach at Newbold College in the area of pastoral care, when news went around in England that a pastor had committed suicide. A very respected pastor that, in fact, I had studied together at Newbold College some 30 years earlier. Okay, so I knew him, though not very well, but he had committed suicide. He had a long history of depression, and apparently the suicide happened when his medication was changed. Now, the story going around in Britain, he was such a good pastor. What a shame he is lost now. He lost his salvation forever. He didn't. I don't think so. I don't believe it, because the argument is plain wrong. If our salvation hinges on our last moment in life, we better make sure we die while being on our knees praying. Most of us will not be on their knees praying when they die. I had an uncle who was 99 who died that way, but usually this grace is not ours. So no, forgiveness is not hinging on whether we can ask for forgiveness the last moment. And I used an example when I then went to England and preached my first sermon in my new appointment, and said, you know, if you're hit by a truck, you better be hit from the back than from the front, because if you're hit from the front, probably you would utter a curse as the last thing you do. So it's ridiculous to expect it that way, that somebody cannot be forgiven that he commits suicide because he didn't ask for forgiveness. And also, and even more basic, we pervert the gospel to a gospel of works. If it hinges on me, the forgiveness, it is Christ alone. So that's what I stand for. That's my biblical thesis. Second thesis, the question of sin and forgiveness. It's a different kind of thesis. You'll notice the question of sin and forgiveness is wrong when it comes to illness and suffering. So even to ask the question, is that a sin that can be forgiven, is a wrong kind of question, especially when we consider depression as an illness rather than a choice, or the LGBTQ harassment and mobbing and so forth as a societal sin rather than the person's choice. The biblical example would be the man who was born blind. You remember the story Jesus tells? Who sinned, he or his parents? And Jesus says, what a wrong question you can ask. Neither. No, they probably sinned as well. His parents probably did sin, and he did sin as well. But that's not an issue. It's irrelevant, this particular question. So basically what I'm saying is our image of God is somewhat weird if it all depends on us. let's come to the last slide, and that is my conclusion for today. And the main thing is compassion, 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 compassion. With people who have suicidal ideation, let's not talk them out of it or raise their level of guilt feelings. Let's have compassion.
Mhm.
Let's also have compassion with those who have lost someone to suicide rather than asking weird questions. And please, please speak up when church members, and especially church members, speculate, about this friend of mine, this colleague of mine, this pastor in England. Lots of speculation why he committed suicide. No, there is more than meets the eye. And being judgmental is not the right answer. We should always interfere when people start getting judgmental, because the Bible plainly tells us, do not judge lest ye be judged. And last but not least, celebrate life in its diversity, and that includes even our pain. Celebrate life in its pain as well. This is the hospital chaplain in me speaking here, not the masochist. Okay? So, at last, some hands are up already. We can come to our discussion.